Janine, thank you so much for joining me today. We've got the Women Who Build Summit right around the corner, and I'm just looking forward to getting to know you a little bit better and talk about resilient and sustainable women of green. So,
Sure. I'm Janine Helwig. I am the Director of Utilities at MIT. I've been there for 2 years, and prior to my time at MIT, I was at the George Washington University, which is where I started my career in higher education. I was there for almost a decade. Didn't start in utilities, was actually, my background's in design engineering and environmental water and wastewater engineering. So somehow meandered into the energy industry and then eventually into facilities management. And that's how I got here today.
But there's so much there. And this is a group of people that represent the entire AEC industry. And so I'm sure that you're going to have owners in the room that are thinking, okay, what do I need to be looking at now so that whatever I'm paying to construct will be compliant and sustainable and more green in the future? But then, the architects and the engineers, they have the same question. How do I realize the client's vision with what's going, and then the CMs, and it just goes down the line, and the why we want to do it is the same, I would assume, for almost everybody. How we're going to do it, that's where variation starts to come into play, and then what each unique site is going to do to realize those visions. And so I'm just really curious, like, how do you have such a big conversation and make it meaningful to that diverse of a demographic that's going to be in the room?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I have the privilege of, being invited to speak on the opening panel, which is focused on resilience and sustainability. I think it's going to be a lively discussion on the current state of affairs, where we're trying to go. Particularly, I'm representing the owner side in higher education, which is sort of, like you said, the forefront of leading this industry and where we're trying to go. A lot of people are looking at campuses, district energy as leaders and where we're going to go, because we can make the most impact there, collaborating with the academic communities, et cetera. We're also going to be talking about the grid infrastructure. What is available to us now? What do we need to do to get there to help us achieve some of those climate commitments? So you definitely don't want to miss it, because I think we're going to be having some discussions about, like, are we ready? How are we going to get there? What's the transition look like to getting there? Having those goals is important, but also talking about, what are some of the interim solutions with the current technologies that we have available? How are we going to use those to get to our goals? And we have to be nimble and flexible and dynamic, not just being set on those ambitious goals, but also being practical in terms of coming up with various pathways to reaching those goals, and, sort of having that goal exercise first, setting the goals, and then working backwards from that, and then looking at the pathways, and then looking at it from a business case perspective, and not just simply from, are we achieving these goals? Because we are impacting a lot of the business perspective at some of these institutions. So we have to look at the financial scenarios, we have to look at the operational scenarios without, impacting the mission of a lot of our organizations and institutes and what we're trying to do. I think I would frame it from, rather than waiting for the next generation, is really the future is now, right? This current generation, it's already impacting us, right? So we should be looking beyond, it's going to impact our kids and the future generations. That's why this is really exciting, because we get to be part of this apex of climate change. And, as a society, how are we going to be making an impact on something greater than just, our individual roles in it, right? So that's really exciting. And I think teaching, not just the kids in science and math these days in STEM, I think it's really just thinking beyond their impact individually, and how all those added up together contribute to a greater good to society. And I know that sounds cheesy and cliche, but it's a different generation, because back then we didn't really think about like, if I recycle this one can, it's going to impact anything. We sort of just grew up in a different age, right? We just grew up in a different generation and a different way of thinking. And I think with kids now, they're a lot more eco-conscious. They're a lot more conscious in general of their impacts to society on a global level and not just within their microcosms. So teaching kids, I think, like my son is already asking me, like, why wasn't there that much snow in New England this year, right? And I was trying to explain climate change to him, and I think he's only 6, so that concept was kind of lost on him, but but he was curious, and just starting to explain, why does the temperature of the ocean impact, how much snow or how little snow we get in certain areas of the world. And so starting that curiosity at that young age is what I would encourage.
Well, and do you think, and maybe I just don't have a good handle on it, but I think that the solutions lie far beyond engineering and
Absolutely.
architecture. It's like there are economic things to consider. You take away one thing, you add another, like the systematic impact of change. So there's an economic element to it. There's a political science element to it, and this is one of those important issues. And I think it's important and difficult because it's not a single field of study. It impacts everything. It was caused by everything. To make a change is going to require thinking along everything.
Agreed.
So I often think like, so if I was speaking to a high school student who was asking me what to study in college to make an impact on our climate, I don't know what I would tell them because it's so complex. What would you say? How would you help someone who wanted to, be a part of the change to prepare to? I hear what you said, it is now, but it's not going to end next week. It's now for the entire eternity of now. So, and it's always going to be changing, right?
Right. That's such a fun question. I mean, I'm obviously biased. I'm an engineer, so I would, of course, encourage the young minds to study engineering if you're interested in how things work and taking things apart and really understanding, having a good foundation of how things work, then be an engineer, right? But on the flip side, and I don't think enough engineering schools do this, maybe it's different now than when I used to go to school, is focusing on some of the humanities side of it, right? So like you said, it's not just engineering solutions or technologies. It's about processes and people. I think, going more into like the softer side of things, like leadership, it's using empathy, not just within our organizations and trying to solve problems, but also just from like an environmental justice standpoint, right? I think you can't have a discussion on climate change without having conversations about climate justice with communities who are not as fortunate as others. And so that's becoming a more prominent discussion in conversations. And so I think rather than simply looking at it as an engineering solution in our little engineering box, we need to kind of go beyond that and looking at it from a humanity standpoint and globally as well.
Right. It's just not an easy thing because it's such a big kind of nebulous thing, isn't it?
The problem of solving climate change.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, and I think what's great about this event is really demonstrating that it's going to be an all hands approach. It's not just a problem for the politicians or the engineers or the professors at our institutions to come up with the next greatest technology. It's all hands on deck, right? And it's everything from processes that we can change today, the people that we can work with today and collaborate. That's where you're going to get sort of the groundwork done. We can wait all day long for emerging technologies, but we really need to address what we can now, or yesterday rather. I think that's what's critical today.
Yeah, we can't wait for perfection. We have to make incremental changes to move forward. What do you see in the short term hitting the the construction market, for lack of a better word, like that that people should maybe be more aware of and look into more because it's available now. And I mean, what I have in my head is I don't know, equipment changes, like what are we using on job sites that are already, like, they may be early market things, but they're already kind of out there, but people may not be aware of them so much. Like that's kind of where I'm going, almost like the early adopter piece. Like what's in that early stage of the early adopter curve?
What technologies are currently out there in terms of early adoption? Yeah, I mean, I think, geothermal has already sort of is already been adopted, but like large scale, it's still being sort of deployed. So that's kind of, I would say it's not new anymore. I just heard something the other day for construction, and I'm not in construction, but mass timber is becoming more popular as a construction material for buildings. So that's kind of exciting. So I think embodied carbon in construction materials is going to become a more prominent, topic of discussion in construction. On the facility side, we've been talking a lot about like industrial sized heat pumps and electric boilers, which I know, I always joke because one of our professors at MIT think electric boilers, in his words, are thermodynamic nonsense, which I don't disagree with, but they can be a solution that we can look at in the interim until we have that, next best emerging technology.
Of owners, architects, engineers, CMs, and some trades like GCs and some trades is kind of the stew of what we call the AEC industry. And I come from the construction management side of the industry. I'm an industrial engineer, but I fell into construction management, and I do a lot of work with the trades. So I work for a national mechanical firm as well. And now I do a lot of consulting for MWBE trade contractors. So very much like kind of in there with some of the things. And one of the questions I would be really interested in being able to answer one day is how would the owners most like to see the CMs, GCs, and trades being more proactive to help the owners realize their goals in this universe? I don't know if I crafted that question really well, but yeah, I think you know what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I think it's being flexible and coming up with multiple pathways for getting to our goals, and not just being stuck on this is the answer and this is the only way you can get to your goals. And then also, like I mentioned, the goal setting exercise earlier is really sitting down and with all the stakeholders in the room and saying, what are we trying to achieve? Is it to eliminate fossil fuels? Is it to get to carbon neutrality? Is it to meet compliance with some of these aggressive federal and state mandates? Okay, from there we can say, okay, if you want to get to 100% of XYZ goals, this is what it's going to cost you. And then you look at it and you say, well, this is going to bankrupt our organization. We can't spend $500 billion to, become carbon neutral. And then that's when I was saying it becomes more of a business case. And then working backwards and saying, okay, well, if we spend, some percent of that, we will meet 90 or 95% of the goals. Is that good enough for us? And working with sort of the implementers. And when I say implementers, the engineers and the construction managers who are going to be our partners in this, and saying, is that achievable, right? And then alongside with that is also looking at how you do things business as usual, and comparing that to what it would cost from a life cycle perspective to achieve your goals, whether it's that 100% of the goal or 90% of your goal or whatever you have. And so, you look at the business as usual case and compare that to like the meeting your goals, 100%, 90%, whatever. And then even with the carbon tax, if you will, of putting on the premium of it, this is what it's going to cost us, not to do business as usual, but to get to whatever percent carbon neutrality. When you compare those scenarios side by side, you're not talking about significantly higher premiums, right? So my point is, if you don't do anything and you just leave your deferred maintenance as is, you don't address any of that, your infrastructure is failing, business as usual, and you're not meeting any goals, why would you want to do that, right? So that's where we can have the CMs integrated into the process, because we lean on them heavily from a feasibility and implementation standpoint. They're going to be the ones giving us accurate cost estimates, telling us what kind of new market, what materials are out there on the market, just construction feasibility, those types of things. I think working with the owners on that to help them justify that, okay, we don't want to do business as usual, we want to do whatever it takes to get us to our decarbonization goals. I think that's where the value in that partnership will come out of. On sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's like there's such a human side to this conversation. Mm-hmm. It's like, absolutely. I mean, and it's the human side that I think has made it so difficult. I understand that the technology is behind the thinking, which happens a lot, right? Where we're like, oh, we've got to be able to do this, but we just don't have the technology yet. And so to your point, we can't wait for the perfect technology. We've got to be there now. But I mean, we've known about global warming since the 1950s. They had maybe even the 40s. They actually had charts starting. The technology started to develop in a way that it could be monitored, and scientists started to notice differences that were alarming. Way back then. That's like what, 80 years ago? Yeah. And we're still, trying to get people to admit that there is a problem. Yeah. That's a human side.
Yeah, alarm bells, the impacts weren't as noticeable, right? People were still talking about like, oh, like, at least in New England, there's a lot of people who grew up in New England who complain every winter they would have all these snowstorms, right? And in the last decade or so, it's only been 1 or 2 big storms. If that's not climate change, we don't know what is. So we haven't really noticed some of the more significant impacts until recently, like some of these crazy storms, tornadoes, wildfires, all that, where, and then it becomes politicized, where everyone's like, oh, it's just, this is the Earth's natural way of progressing through the centuries, and it's just a bunch of fanfare about nothing, right? But I think, like you said, it is a people problem, because we need to take the political out of it and look at it as like a societal issue, right? And again, the justice thing comes back into that. It's not just about us, our first world country, and how reliant we are on our cars, but it's also about like countries who are in earthquake zones, who are seeing more earthquakes, for example, or suffering because of super hot summers or temperatures, et cetera. I mean, that's just a basic example, but
yeah. What do you hope when I often, whenever I prepare for something, I always think, okay, what are my 1 or 2 things that I really want people to walk away with? Like, they can forget everything else I say, but if just this 1, maybe 2 things resonate, then it was a win. What are those for you?
Yeah, and I think I alluded to this earlier, that solving the climate crisis is really going to be an all hands on deck approach. It's not just for the engineers or just the politicians or some of the groups in between. And we're going to need flexibility. We're going to need nimbleness. We have to be practical in the pathways that will lead us to meeting our goals. While many of our commitments are ambitious, we have to balance that with the technologies that are available today, leverage existing infrastructure, which I think is key. We have to remember that. We can't forget about our existing buildings and deferred maintenance, et cetera. And we also have to consider, the current landscape and the utility infrastructure that's available to us today, and work with our partners to, come up with some solutions. So, at the same time, I think having an end goal is great, but we also need to consider, I mentioned this earlier too, the transition in the interim technologies and the pathways that will help us reach those commitments in 2050 or whatever it is that we've set. So let's not forget about, the in-between period, because that's what's going to get us to the future, and not just focus on, the future and where we want to be.
So it seems to me that because this is such a meaty issue and so important, it is one of those that the conversation just needs to continue, and there will be sparks flying all over. Each day there will be some new spark for a new idea, right? A new inspiration that might very well lead to that technology that we need to be created. And it's like so important to have these conversations in front of diverse thinkers, right? Like diverse groups of people with diverse experience, because it is such a large problem that it is going to take so much creative and out of the box thinking that you can only get that by having a conversation frequently with different people, different backgrounds. I mean, we just need to figure out, like, let's get some musicians in the room and maybe they'll come up with a great idea. Actually, the keynote speaker is a musician.
Yeah, there you go.
She might just like, oh, why didn't we think of this?
Yeah.
Hey, I spoke to June. She might very well ask a question that makes everybody go, oh, of course.
Didn't think about that.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, just keeping an open mind, really. Like, going back to your earlier question about technologies that are sort of new, but starting to get implemented more, is microreactors and nuclear. But sometimes you say the word nuclear in a community and literally, no pun intended, it's like nuclear, like people just want to run away, right? So it's being open-minded to that and changing the way we look at certain technologies and not just writing them off because, oh, nuclear is bad, nuclear's, Fukushima or Chernobyl. And how do we produce safe, alternatives to that, so that, because it is still a clean carbon technology without using fossil fuels, but we have to be open-minded and come up with different solutions for maybe the disposal of nuclear or whatever it is that concerns the public. But just in general, being, like I said, flexible and nimble and open-minded to new technologies, having those conversations, listening, that's, I think, what drives innovation, and not just staying in your lane and in your box, right?